Hi, this video will provide you with a brief overview of the lesson planning process and key elements to the lesson planning process. I'm going to go over these elements a little bit quickly because I'm not intending this to be everything you ever need to know about the lesson planning process. We're going to do a lot more studying and learning and practicing as we go along further in the course. So first of all, you need to think about what your rationale is when you make a lesson plan, or for that matter, a curriculum unit. Now, the difference between, let's say, a single lesson plan and a unit of instruction, in the simplest possible terms, would be that a unit would be a series of lesson plans. Let's say a 1 week unit would be 5 lesson plans, or if you're doing a month-long unit, that would be a month worth of plans tied together, connecting a common theme. For instance, if you're teaching in science and you're exploring gravity, then you might have a month-long unit about gravity tied together with certain themes of how gravity operates, with lesson plans strung together that are connected by that unifying theme. That's what I mean by the difference between a unit and a lesson plan. But your rationale basically is your justification for the choices you make in your lesson plans or in your unit, including why are you studying this, what are the learning goals, what are your objectives, what materials will you use, how will you assess student learning. So you want to think about the central concepts that your students will study. Why are you teaching these concepts? How are you teaching these concepts? Why this plan and why these state standards instead of others? So importantly, you want to build connections, especially from one lesson plan to the next within a unit of instruction. It's very important for your students to be able to connect prior knowledge that they learned in one lesson with knowledge that they're gaining in today's lesson, so that they can build bridges between one lesson and the other, and also hopefully they can make connections between what they're learning in your classroom and their daily lives and what matters to them, what interests them. So then we think about instructional goals. Instructional goals are what you want your students to learn in this lesson. How will this learning prepare them for what they need to do? And especially as they advanced in science and learning, for instance, let's say they're learning gravity, how will their learning in today's class prepare them for the next lesson? How are you planning ahead to help students advance? When we get from goals, we next connect them to instructional objective. The purpose of an objective is to ensure that learning is focused and clear, so that both you know what's going on as well as your students know what's going on. Learning objectives should be measurable. You should be able to assess, especially in the behaviorist sense. You should be able to assess whether learning is taking place or not. So you say that this is the objective. Okay, so how do you measure whether students are meeting this learning objective or not? Be very concise when you write your objectives. Don't go on and on and on. They can be in one sentence or 2 sentences in length. Be singular. An objective should focus on one aspect of Bloom's taxonomy. Remember, you've got your cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains of Bloom's taxonomy. We'll go over that further in this discussion. You want to describe expected behaviors. Remember in the earlier video, which I hopefully want you to watch before you watch this one, but either way it'll make sense. In the video that I made about behaviorism, I talked about the fact that the state, not just in the state of Arkansas, but state broadly, all 50 states, have a tendency to expect behavioral objectives, lesson plans that your state and district are going to want. Yes, um, they're a quilt weaving approach in the sense that you can bring in constructivist and socio-emotional learning theories, for instance, into these lesson plans too. But the core aspect of how these lesson plans are supposed to be put together, the way that the categories are written, objectives, for instance, they're very behavioristic in nature, and that's not an accident. When you go back, I mean, this you haven't studied that in this course so much, but if you go back into the history of how curriculum theory was put together under the influence of people like Bobbitt and Tyler, you can find a very strong emphasis on behaviorism in an approach called Tylerism. So you want to be very realistic. An objective should focus on an observable objective. Notice observable, that's measurable. That's very behavioristic, by the way. Um, don't get into these undefinable traits. Behavior criteria conditions should be clearly communicated to your students, clearly understood, and a person reading your lesson plans should very clearly understand what your objectives are. You should select state standards to target that meets your objectives. Your objectives should be tied to state standards. And I've given you some videos that'll hopefully help you out for supplemental. Objectives should be written either beginning with students will learn to or whatever. Bottom line is look at Bloom's action verbs, and we'll study that more. I'm also going to give you some supplemental material along with this video about Bloom's taxonomy as well as Bloom's action verbs. Think about how to tie your writing of objectives to Bloom's action verbs about what students will actually do in practice. How will these behaviors be demonstrated and tracked? Use Bloom's action verbs. Write, define, list, compare when you write your objectives. Bloom's taxonomy is basically cognitive, that deals with specific domains of knowledge. Affective, usually having to do with feelings, emotions, also judgment. And psychomotor, usually having to do with body movement. Oftentimes psychomotor is associated with early childhood education, but that it's not limited to that, of course, especially when you're talking about PE. So when we get into knowledge, this tends to deal with the cognitive. So I'm going to deal with the cognitive domain of Bloom's taxonomy first, then move into the affective, and finally go into the psychomotor domain so that you understand how to tie this in with your objectives. So with knowledge in the cognitive domain, we deal with exhibiting previously learned material, such as recalling facts, recalling terms, basic concepts, and answers. Sometimes it's also simply stated recall, for instance. A lot of achievement tests deal specifically with objectives at the knowledge level of Bloom's taxonomy. Some key words you can use in writing objectives: who, what, when, where, why. Find, students will define, students will label, that sort of thing. Some questions you can focus on within Bloom's taxonomy: what is, or how is, or when did something happen, so on and so forth. That's basic knowledge domain. Again, how would you show? Can you select? Who are the main characters, so on and so forth. Next, we deal with comprehension. Comprehension is the ability to reorganize, restate, and interpret facts for the purpose of this domain. It deals with demonstrating an understanding of these facts by organizing, comparing them, translating them, interpreting them, and you see how these words would translate into actions that the students would do. The students would interpret, the students would compare. So keywords you can use in your objectives: students will compare, students will contrast, students will interpret, students will extend, illustrate, outline. Questions you can ask of your students to do: how would you classify? How would you compare? How would you contrast? How will you state or interpret something in your own words? Rephrasing, all of this deals with comprehension. Which statement supports? Can you explain what is happening? What is meant by something? Next, we deal with the application category, utilizing knowledge in a new and different situation. A lot of test items deal with application in new situation. Some attributes, solving problems by acquiring new knowledge, facts, techniques in a different sort of way. Keywords with application deal with apply, building, choosing, interviewing, experimenting, utilizing. How would you use something? What examples can you find of something? These help students focus on applying. Next, we get into analysis. Analysis deals with examining, breaking information into parts, identifying the motives, making inferences based upon evidence. Oftentimes, analysis is tied in with the use of the scientific method of investigation. So some key words would be analyze, categorize, classify, take part in, test. These are all key words you can use, key action verbs you can use when you're writing objectives that trigger that you're dealing with the analysis domain of Bloom's taxonomy. So what are the parts or what are the features? Why do you think something? What is the theme of something? What motive is there? That sort of thing. Now, what if all you're doing is identifying the theme, but you're not explaining, that might just be a knowledge thing. But if you're having them justify why you think the theme is something, that gets into an analysis. So how would you classify something? How would you categorize something? Oftentimes when you are asking the students these questions, you're asking them to also provide a justification for why they deal with these answers. Next, we get into synthesis. Synthesis deals with compiling information together in a new and different way by combining elements and patterns, proposing alternative solutions. This can be characterized by taking various parts of a problem and putting them together to derive meaning from a situation. So what could be combined to improve something? Suppose you could blank, what would you do? Can you formulate a theory for something where you perhaps combine various different sets of information? Next, we get into evaluation, and I'm going through this fairly fast. Like I said, this is a broad overview. Evaluation deals with presenting and defending opinions by making judgment about information, backing up by standards of validity, quality of work, evidence. So again, evaluation isn't just saying I think, but without anything to back it up. You have to provide your opinion based upon evidence and evaluation and judgment. For instance, you're judging a theory and product according to some evidence and some criteria. So, for instance, choose, conclude, defend, decide. All of these are all Bloom's action verbs that trigger the fact that you're dealing with the evaluation domain. And do you agree with the actions of something? What is your opinion about something? How would you recommend? Can you assess the value of something? And again, that gives you a broader view of the cognitive domain. Next, let's get into the affective domain of Bloom's taxonomy. It deals oftentimes with the receiving end of things, being aware of or paying attention to something. Oftentimes it's associated with beauty or the senses, recognizing there may be two sides to a story also. That deals with the judgment aspect. Knowing there are different differences among people in different cultural backgrounds. That can also deal with the affective domain. Making active and willing to respond to something. The value, consistently demonstrating an interest in a particular activity that it's going on. Organization of the affective domain, integrating new values into one's existing value system. Oftentimes, it is characterized by value judgment as well as the sensory, as well as art. So it's constantly behaving, for instance, in accordance with organized value systems that can get into the affective domain. Next, we get into the psychomotor domain of Bloom's taxonomy. This deals with body movements. So, for instance, reflex movements, or basic fundamental movements, or perceptual abilities. If you're working with students develop that, then you're dealing with the psychomotor domain. For instance, helping students develop physical abilities such as endurance, strength, flexibility, skilled movements, swimming, throwing a football, communicating feelings or emotions through bodily actions, pantomime, all of this deals with the psychomotor domain. So, regardless of which of these taxonomy you deal with, you have to think within your lesson plan about what materials will you use. You don't want to be one of those teachers that goes into a lesson activity without prior thought about materials. That's when things get very disorganized. So think very carefully ahead of time about how you will develop the interest of your students by providing them access to certain tools, certain materials. Will you want laboratory material, audiovisual tools, reference books, pens and pencils, etc., folders, whatever, crayons? Think of what you're going to use and why. Oftentimes, you want to start out your activity with what is sometimes called an anticipatory set. Sometimes it's called an activity. Sometimes it's called a gateway activity. Sometimes it's called in Missouri a do now. To be very honest, I'm not all about the phrase do now, but that's very common in Missouri lesson plans. But bottom line is that oftentimes in lesson plans, your state or district will want you to outline what are students doing for about the first 5-10 minutes of class. So ideally, in a good, strong lesson plan, you focus your students' attention early in class. You help students to connect what they're going to be learning today with what they were learning in a previous lesson. Oftentimes, ideally, they're doing it in a way that piques their curiosity. Maybe they're quickly solving a puzzle or whatever. Maybe they've got um, a word problem to solve or a mystery to solve that's connecting prior knowledge with what they're going to be learning today. And very importantly, as part of this anticipatory activity, make sure that students know the objective for the activity. Some basic procedures for good lesson planning, including the anticipatory set, but the lesson planning overall. Make sure that you are engaging, ideally. Make sure that you are clear and detailed, students. List your procedures for the lesson in order that you want them to occur, sequential. Sequential listing is very important in strong lesson planning. So what teaching procedure or instructional technique are you using? Are you modeling for your students? Ideally, you should be doing some sort of demonstration for your students. Are you giving them sufficient information to understand their goals and objectives? Are you checking for their level of understanding? Ideally, the answer is yes. Are you giving them independent practice also? Where you list out your procedures in your lesson plan, and typically district lesson plans. Now, granted, one district format for the lesson plan can differ from the other, and we'll look at various types as we go further in, but not in this video. But uh, they typically do want you to list out your procedures that you're going to be using. So this is where you have to plan for how you are differentiating strategies for learning and what steps will be taken. Um, so again, think about what you want students to learn and how you will help students to learn it as you're planning your procedures. Make sure that you have materials ready for the lesson before you start your lesson. Make sure that you maintain the attention of students. You don't want students to be bored. Clear instructions very much help. Sticking on task clearly helps. Motivation, engagement helps when it comes to attention. Move around the room. Don't just be a statue in the room. Provide simple step-by-step instructions. You don't want your students to be confused. Some key ways to maintain student attention include your own enthusiasm and interest, reinforcing student efforts with very specific forms of praise, varying your instructional methods, providing work that is within their appropriate ability level. I call it a zone of proximal development. Zone of proximal development in a nutshell, and this is a constructivist concept, by the way. We'll learn more about that later. But zone of proximal development is the difference between what a student can do independently right now and the maximum that a student can do with assistance. Ideally, through assessment, you know what the difference between that is, and you're guiding students through increasingly difficult tasks so the student gains increasing mastery and independence at doing increasingly difficult activities. You're demonstrating skills. You're modeling for students what to do and how to do it. You're providing guidance for the students and feedback, and you're monitoring their progress and giving them corrective feedback when needed. You're being careful that they're not overloaded. Cognitive overload deals with, bottom line, that our working memories can only hold so much information at a given time. And so if you've got too much information coming in at once through your working memory, then your working memory will get overloaded, and it won't make its way into your long-term memory. A student who is dealing with cognitive overload is not going to learn very well. Oftentimes in lesson plans, you will see lesson plans with specific spaces for how teachers will do I do, we do it, and you do it activities. I do deals with the teacher demonstrating something or giving clear, explicit directions. We do it deals with a group doing something together. The you do it deals with a student having independent practice. Districts often will list that so that they will encourage teachers to make sure that in a given lesson they are making time for teacher demonstration, for group work as well, and group practice, as well as for student independent practice at a skill. Now, the way that lesson plans often are formatted in a district, it often will list the I do first, the we do second, and the you do third, which will give teachers the impression that this is a very formulaic thing. Now, as you'll learn when you learn more about constructivism in this class, the I do, we do, you do way of looking at it stems from constructivist frameworks. David Pearson had a lot to say about this approach, drawing on scaffolding techniques and zone of proximal development. Douglas Fisher further developed that into very pragmatic approaches, drawing on Pearson's work. And it's not supposed to be as formulaic as it sometimes seems on lesson plan formats. And it's not supposed to be as rigid. It's supposed to be flexible according to assessed student need and student ability level, and it's supposed to be occurring within students' zone of proximal development. So we'll learn more about that as we learn about constructivism. I have a little bit of a concern, very honestly speaking, about some misunderstandings that have taken place over the I do it, we do it, you do it approach, because I know for a fact there are many teachers that hear that phrase and they kind of cringe because they think of it as very rigid, and it's not supposed to be that rigid. But the positive point here that states like to do and districts like to do is they try to emphasize the ideal that you should be making time for teacher explicit instruction, time for students to work together, and time for independent practice. All three of these things are important. So, for example, you might demonstrate to students how you, as a teacher, go about summarization and note-taking. You might model for students how to do something, and then you transition into the class taking notes together, using note-taking strategies, Cornell note-taking, or whatever. The we do it is, of course, group work. So, sharing of ideas. Sometimes you might conference with students. That's another form of we do it. Students might write things I learned from a presentation, and you're working together in groups, that sort of thing. That's the we do it. You guide students to work well in groups. You want to be very intentional in your grouping of students together. Why are you choosing a certain group over another group? Make sure that your students understand their roles and as well as shared responsibilities. And assessment is very key here. Your unit should include summative as well as formative assessment. Summative is basically the assessment that takes place at the end of a unit or the end of a lesson. Did students demonstrate something at the end? For instance, your unit exam. Formative assessment takes place during the lesson, during instruction, in the process. It's formative. It's information of learning taking place, and it's very much active. So the learning behaviors should be assessed using both of these techniques uh, in order for you to be able to tell concretely, are learning objectives being met or not? So think about, as you're writing your lesson plans very concretely, how will you determine whether the learner has acquired the knowledge or the skills that your learning objective stated? Remember, your principal or assistant principal, or me if I'm looking at your lesson plans, should be able to tell, if you state a learning objective, how is that going to be assessed? How can you tell if objectives are being met or not? So again, objectives and assessments are very much linked together. Oftentimes we talk about authentic assessments where students will produce something that is meaningful to them in their daily lives, for instance. That's another form of assessment. We'll study more about assessment methods later. Effective use of assessment includes a clear set of parameters for what they're being tested on, oftentimes through a rubric. Students should have a very clear understanding of how their work will be evaluated, and it should give you a basis for evaluating whether learning is being met or not adequately, and what you can do from there. And based upon student progress, you make modifications in what you're doing, and modifications in your instruction, oftentimes to individual students. Modifications might be needed for special needs, for English language learners, for diverse learners. We'll talk about that more in another lesson, but oftentimes your lesson plan format will include how are you modifying instruction. If a student has a 504 plan, then of course you would want for special education. Then of course you would want to make sure that the law is being followed with that 504 plan. Working with your special education specialist in the school, and based upon assessment, you want to very carefully give feedback back to the student, as well as have feedback to yourself about what you can do next to improve your instruction. The feedback needs to be that you're giving back to the student needs to be clear um, and precise to guide the student. And ideally, oftentimes in your lesson plan, you will have some sort of closure. Not all state or district lesson plan formats will have this, but sometimes you might want to have a closure to the lesson. How will you wrap up the lesson? How will you make for transition? How will you summarize for the students what the key points were that they should have learned during the lesson? Are you having an end of the lesson assessment, for an example? How are you closing up the lesson plan?